January 1944. High above Central Europe. The engines begin before dawn. One by one, then thousands together. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and brutally cold. Metal creaks as it expands under strain. Oxygen masks fog with breath. Below, the continent lies frozen and dark, stitched together by rivers that glint faintly in moonlight. Contrails stretch across the sky, long white scars forming patterns never meant to exist. They widen, overlap, and merge until the heavens themselves seem occupied. From horizon to horizon, aircraft fill the altitude bands, tight formations, measured spacing, relentless order. Inside each bomber, men sit in silence, listening to the rhythm of engines that must not fail. No speeches. No heroics. Just checklists, glances, and the knowledge that turning back is not part of the plan. Far below, Berlin sleeps beneath cloud and winter haze. Searchlights are still cold. Flak guns remain silent. The city has no sense of scale yet, no comprehension of what is forming overhead. Then the sun rises. And with it, the sky darkens. What appears above Germany this morning is not a raid. It is the visible shape of a strategy years in the making. By the winter of 1943, the Second World War had entered a phase of exhaustion and escalation. The easy victories were gone. What remained was industrial endurance. Germany was no longer advancing. At Stalingrad, an entire army had been destroyed the year before. In North Africa, Axis forces had surrendered. Italy had fallen out of the war. Yet the Reich itself remained intact, its cities functioning, its factories running, its leadership defiant. Adolf Hitler still promised survival through strength, technology, and will. For the Allies, the problem was distance. Germany could not be invaded yet. An amphibious landing in Western Europe was still months away, dependent on weather, logistics, and overwhelming superiority. Until then, there was only one way to strike the heart of the Reich directly, from the air. Britain had been doing so since 1940. The Royal Air Force, battered during the Battle of Britain, had shifted its strategy. Night bombing became doctrine, driven by necessity. Darkness reduced losses. It also reduced accuracy. Entire cities were targeted not for specific factories, but for morale and disruption. Hamburg burned in 1943. Cologne, Essen, and the Ruhr followed. The German population endured firestorms and displacement, yet industrial output continued. The United States arrived with a different belief. American air planners had studied war in classrooms before they experienced it in the sky. They believed that precision bombing, conducted in daylight, could cripple an enemy's ability to fight without the indiscriminate destruction of night raids. Factories, rail yards, power stations, hit these, and the war machine would collapse. It was a theory rooted in interwar studies and reinforced by confidence in American technology. At the center of that confidence stood the B-17 Flying Fortress. Heavily armed. High-flying. Built to absorb punishment. Its designers believed that overlapping defensive fire from tight formations could protect bombers without constant fighter escort. The aircraft became not just a machine, but a doctrine given wings. When the U.S. 8th Air Force began operations from Britain in 1942, reality intervened quickly. German fighters tore into unescorted formations. Losses mounted. Entire crews vanished over France and the Low Countries. Missions deep into Germany became costly gambles. Still, the strategy did not change. It intensified. By 1943, American production had reached a scale unseen in history. Airfields spread across eastern England. Runways lengthened. Control towers multiplied. Bomb dumps grew into small cities. The 8th Air Force transformed from an experiment into a force measured in thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men. This was not merely a military buildup. It was organizational warfare. Every mission required precise timing. Weather forecasts across continents. Fuel calculations accurate to minutes. Formation assembly points over the English coast. Radio silence enforced. A single delay could ripple through the sky and shatter cohesion. Across the Channel, Germany watched and adapted. The Luftwaffe was still formidable. Its pilots were experienced, its aircraft deadly. Radar stations lined the coast. Flak towers rose above cities, concrete giants mounting heavy guns. Searchlight belts waited to catch intruders in artificial daylight. The Reich had prepared its shield carefully, assuming that mass alone would never be enough to break through. Berlin, above all, was considered protected. The capital was more than a city. It was a symbol. Administrative heart, propaganda center, and proof of survival. While other cities burned, Berlin remained largely untouched by daylight bombing. Its defenses were layered, dense, and prioritized. To reach it meant flying farther than most missions. Deeper into enemy airspace. Beyond the margin for error. For the Americans, that distance was not a deterrent. It was a challenge to be solved. By late 1943, escort fighters with longer range, most notably the P-51 Mustang, began to appear in increasing numbers. Their arrival quietly removed the last technical barrier. Bombers no longer had to fly alone. What followed was not a single decision, but an accumulation of momentum. Production met doctrine. Doctrine met opportunity. And opportunity pointed, inevitably, toward the German capital. The winter skies over Europe were about to become a proving ground, not just for aircraft, but for an idea, that mass, organization, and daylight precision could bend a nation to silence. The question was no longer whether Berlin could be reached. It was what would happen when the sky above it could no longer contain the number of aircraft assigned to one purpose. To understand how 1,000 bombers could appear over a single city, it is necessary to step away from the sky and look at the ground. The 8th Air Force was not built around individual heroism. It was constructed as a system. By early 1944, Eastern England had become an enormous forward operating base. More than 100 airfields stretched from Norfolk to Oxfordshire, each assigned to specific bomber groups and wings. Every field had its own routines, but all operated on a single clock. When missions launched, the countryside filled with the sound of engines in staggered waves, lifting off every 30 seconds, sometimes for hours. The B-17 itself was only one component of a larger equation. Each aircraft required thousands of man-hours of maintenance. Engines were swapped overnight. Bullet holes were patched with speed and pragmatism. Crews were rotated, trained, and replaced at a rate that assumed attrition as normal. Formation flying was drilled relentlessly. Bombers did not fly for elegance or comfort. They flew to survive. Boxes were stacked vertically and horizontally, allowing machine guns to cover blind spots. It was geometry in motion, calculated to reduce vulnerability while maximizing offensive reach. Above them all sat a command structure that favored repetition over improvisation. Routes were planned to the minute. Altitudes assigned by group. Assembly points plotted over rivers and coastline landmarks. Once airborne, deviations were discouraged. The power of the bomber force lay not in flexibility, but in predictability enforced at scale. Across the Channel, German air defense planners observed this with concern. The Reich's air defense network was sophisticated. Early warning radar stations, Freya and Würzburg, fed information to command centers that directed fighter squadrons toward incoming formations. Anti-aircraft guns ringed cities, their crews trained to fire in calculated patterns, creating lethal corridors of steel and explosive. Berlin, in particular, was surrounded by one of the densest flak belts in Europe. German fighter doctrine emphasized interception. Pilots were scrambled to attack bombers head-on, aiming for the cockpit or engines. Rockets and heavy cannons were introduced to break formations quickly. The intent was to inflict damage early, force bombers to turn back, and reduce the number that reached the target. For a time, it worked. American losses in 1943 were severe. Missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg demonstrated the cost of deep penetration without adequate escort. Crews understood the statistics. Survival was measured in missions completed, not years served. The psychological toll was immense. Yet the response was not retreat. It was expansion. The introduction of long-range escort fighters changed the geometry of the air war. The P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and high-altitude performance, could stay with the bombers to and from the target. It did more than protect. It hunted. German fighters no longer waited safely for bombers to pass before engaging on the return leg. They were pursued, drawn into combat on unequal terms. Attrition began to favor the attackers. The Luftwaffe faced constraints the Allies did not. Fuel shortages limited training hours. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer flights logged. Aircraft production struggled under the weight of Allied bombing. Every loss became harder to replace. Still, Berlin remained a challenge. Its distance demanded flawless execution. Weather over Central Europe was unpredictable. Cloud layers could obscure targets. Icing threatened engines and control surfaces. A single storm could scatter formations across hundreds of miles. To send 1,000 bombers toward one city required more than courage. It required confidence that the system could absorb failure without collapsing. By early 1944, that confidence existed. Mission planners no longer asked how many aircraft could be spared. They asked how many could be committed at once. The answer kept growing. When orders were issued for the largest daylight raids yet conceived, there was no announcement, no ceremony. Crews read their briefing maps in silence. Red tape lines stretched farther than many had ever seen. The destination was unmistakable. Berlin. Not as a symbol to be touched once, but as a target to be overwhelmed. The stage was set not for a dramatic duel, but for saturation. For a moment when the defensive assumptions of the Reich would be tested against numbers that did not pause, negotiate, or thin with distance. As the bombers gathered in the winter sky, the air war shifted from contest to pressure, steady, accumulating, and impossible to ignore. What followed would not be decided by a single aircraft or pilot, but by how human endurance fared when confronted with an industrial force moving at altitude. A B-17 at altitude was not a place designed for comfort or contemplation. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The aircraft was unpressurized. Crewmen wore electrically heated suits that failed as often as they functioned. Frost formed along the metal skin. Oxygen flowed constantly, a reminder that survival depended on systems behaving as designed. Inside, 10 men occupied their stations. Pilot and co-pilot focused on engine gauges and formation spacing. The navigator worked his charts, calculating drift and ground speed with dead reckoning and brief radio fixes. The bombardier lay prone in the nose, staring through the Norden bomb sight at a world reduced to geometry. There was little conversation once the mission settled into cruise. Noise filled every space. Engines roared. Turrets rotated with mechanical steadiness. Time slowed, stretched by anticipation. The most dangerous moments often came without warning. Crew survival depended less on individual action than on collective discipline. One aircraft straying from formation became a target. A single engine failure increased fuel consumption and stress on the airframe. Decisions were made quickly, with consequences understood but rarely discussed aloud. For many airmen, Berlin represented a psychological boundary. Missions to France or the Ruhr were dangerous, but survivable in theory. Berlin was different. Its name carried weight. It was farther, more heavily defended, and widely understood as the core of German power. The technological angle begins with the aircraft itself. The B-17 Flying Fortress was built to take punishment. Its structure could absorb flak damage that would cripple lighter aircraft. Multiple engines provided redundancy. Defensive armament covered nearly every approach angle. But the aircraft was not invulnerable. Head-on attacks exploited thinner armor. Flak bursts did not need direct hits to be lethal. Shrapnel could sever control cables, ignite fuel, or incapacitate crew. The fortress could fly with damage, but only up to a point. Against it stood the Luftwaffe's interceptors. Fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190 climbed aggressively, trading altitude for speed. Later variants carried heavy cannons and air-to-air rockets designed to break formations quickly. German pilots understood that disrupting the bomber stream was often more effective than destroying individual aircraft. As bomber numbers increased, however, the sky changed. Defensive fire overlapped. Escorts appeared in growing numbers. What had once been a gauntlet became a crowded battle space where survival depended on coordination and timing. The civilian angle unfolded far below. For Berlin's population, the war had long been present, but unevenly felt. Night raids disrupted sleep. Air raid sirens were familiar. Shelters were part of daily life. Yet daylight had offered a sense of separation, a time when the city functioned, worked, and pretended to be normal. That illusion eroded as the raids intensified. When sirens sounded during the day, factories stopped. Trams halted. Streets emptied. People descended into bunkers not knowing if they would return to their homes or emerge into ruins. Unlike night bombing, daylight raids were visible, audible, undeniable. The sky itself became part of the experience. The scale mattered. One formation overhead could be endured. Dozens could be rationalized. Hundreds changed perception. The noise alone, continuous, layered, unending, created a sense of inevitability. There was no clear beginning or end, only the steady passage of aircraft. German propaganda insisted on resilience. Newspapers minimized damage. Radio broadcasts spoke of successful defenses. But civilians saw the truth above them. They watched as contrails formed grids over their city, as flak clouds marked where shells exploded without visible effect. The human response was not panic, but fatigue. A deepening awareness that endurance did not equal safety. Between the bomber crews and the civilians lay the sky itself. It became a space contested not just by weapons, but by belief. Could machines protect men at this scale? Could defenses designed for dozens of attackers cope with hundreds? Could a city be defended if the enemy chose to fill the air rather than test its edges? As the winter of 1944 progressed, these questions ceased to be theoretical. Each mission added weight to the answer. The bombers did not come once and disappear. They returned. In greater numbers. With tighter coordination. With escorts that stayed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted, not through a single dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of pressure that no individual on either side could relieve alone. That pressure would soon be felt most sharply by those tasked with stopping the stream at its source. In offices filled with maps and weather charts, American commanders faced decisions measured not in moments, but in percentages. Loss rates. Production capacity. Replacement timelines. Every mission was evaluated against what the system could endure. Generals like Karl Spatz and Ira Eker did not speak in terms of individual sorties. They spoke of campaigns. Their objective was not simply to bomb Berlin, but to force the Luftwaffe into the air repeatedly, until experience, fuel, and aircraft were exhausted. The city was both target and bait. This approach marked a shift. Precision remained the stated goal, but the broader effect was attritional. By compelling German fighters to engage on unfavorable terms, the Americans sought to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force before an invasion ever began. Orders reflected that priority. Bombers flew even when weather complicated accuracy. Escorts were encouraged to engage aggressively, extending beyond defensive posture. The air war became less about avoiding losses and more about absorbing them in exchange for irreversible advantage. From the German command perspective, the picture darkened. The Luftwaffe had been built for a different war. Early victories relied on concentrated effort and experienced pilots. By 1944, those veterans were gone. Replacements arrived with limited training hours, thrust into combat against formations that filled the sky and escorts that outperformed them at altitude. Commanders faced impossible choices. Concentrate fighters near Berlin and leave other regions exposed, or disperse forces and risk losing the capital's protection. Fuel shortages forced units to ration flights. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of spare parts. Even when interceptions succeeded, the cost was high. Each engagement consumed resources that could not be easily replaced. Each pilot lost represented years of training gone in seconds. The realization spread quietly through the ranks: the enemy could afford losses that Germany could not. The enemy angle, seen from the cockpit, reflected this imbalance. German pilots described the bomber stream not as formations, but as walls. Breaking through defensive fire became increasingly dangerous. Escorts appeared earlier, stayed longer, and pursued relentlessly. Withdrawal was no longer guaranteed. For American crews, the presence of escorts altered the emotional landscape. The sense of isolation lessened, but risk remained. Losses continued. Aircraft burned. Parachutes opened, or did not. Survival still felt arbitrary. Yet there was a growing awareness that each mission weakened the opposition in ways previous raids had not. Fewer fighters rose to meet them. Attacks came later. Coordination faltered. Flak remained heavy, but predictable. The moral angle emerged not in speeches, but in consequences. Daylight bombing was presented as precise, but reality was constrained by weather, navigation, and human error. Bombs missed targets. Civilian areas were hit. Casualties mounted. Crews knew this, even if they did not see it directly. For Berlin's population, distinctions between precision and area bombing blurred beneath falling ordnance. The experience of destruction did not depend on doctrine. It depended on proximity. This raised questions that no participant could fully answer at the time. Was the strategy shortening the war, or prolonging suffering? Were losses justified by eventual outcomes? Could restraint exist at this scale? Commanders believed the answers would only become clear in hindsight. In the present, momentum ruled. Scale itself became a weapon. The sight of hundreds of bombers approaching in daylight challenged assumptions about defense. It suggested that protection was finite, while offense could grow without apparent limit. Each raid reinforced the perception that the sky belonged increasingly to the attackers. For German civilians, this realization eroded confidence more effectively than any speech. For Luftwaffe pilots, it transformed missions into acts of defiance rather than expectation. For American crews, it reframed danger as contribution, each sortie part of a larger inevitability. As winter wore on, raids grew larger. Routes became bolder. Berlin's defenses, though still lethal, no longer dictated terms. The air war had entered a phase where the question was no longer whether bombers would reach the city, but how many would arrive at once, and how much resistance would remain when they did. That question would be answered not in planning rooms or training fields, but on a day when the sky itself seemed insufficient to contain the number of aircraft committed to a single purpose. The morning does not begin with explosions. It begins with reports. Radar stations along the German coast detect movement before dawn, returns so dense they overlap on the screens. Controllers mark headings, altitudes, speeds. At first, it appears like previous raids, only larger. Then the data continues to grow. New contacts appear behind the first wave. Then behind those. The numbers do not stabilize. By the time formations cross the Dutch coastline, it is clear this is not a probe or diversion. The bomber stream stretches for hundreds of miles. Multiple altitude layers. Tight spacing. No obvious gaps. For German planners, accustomed to measuring raids in dozens of aircraft, the scale defies immediate categorization. Fighter units scramble. Engines start under pressure. Aircraft lift off into cold air, climbing hard to interception height. Pilots receive vectors toward what is now being described simply as the stream. There is no single formation to attack, no exposed flank to exploit. Only density. Above them, the American bomber force continues assembling as planned. Groups merge seamlessly at pre-arranged points. Delays are absorbed. Weather deviations corrected. Even minor losses during assembly do not disrupt the overall structure. The system holds. At altitude, contrails form a ceiling. Sunlight reflects off aluminum skins, producing flashes visible from miles away. Crews can see other formations stacked above and below them, something rarely experienced before. It is not reassuring. It is overwhelming. Escort fighters appear in strength. P-51s weave ahead and alongside the bombers, scanning constantly. Their presence extends the protective envelope far deeper than previous missions allowed. German fighters attempting early interception are met sooner, forced to engage before reaching optimal attack positions. As the bomber stream advances inland, flak batteries begin firing. Berlin's outer defenses open up first. Heavy guns send timed shells upward, black bursts forming patterns ahead of the formations. The explosions are violent but dispersed. At this scale, saturation works both ways. Guns cannot concentrate on every target. Fire becomes statistical rather than precise. Inside the bombers, the effect is visceral. Aircraft shudder as shockwaves ripple through the air. Shrapnel rattles against fuselages. Occasionally, a shell detonates close enough to tear metal, sever lines, wound crew. Damaged aircraft struggle to maintain position. Some fall back. Some descend. A few spiral downward, trailing smoke. But the stream does not thin. German fighters penetrate the formation in places, executing head-on attacks through curtains of defensive fire. Cannon rounds strike noses and wings. Turrets respond. Tracers converge. Seconds determine outcomes. Fighters break away or disappear into clouds of debris. Losses occur on both sides. Yet the imbalance is apparent. For every bomber destroyed, fighters expend ammunition, fuel, and often their own aircraft. Escorts pursue relentlessly, turning disengagement into combat. As Berlin comes into range, the city's inner defenses activate. Searchlights sweep the sky despite daylight, attempting to track individual aircraft. Flak intensifies. The air fills with smoke and drifting debris. From the ground, the noise is continuous, a layered thunder that does not fade. Bombardiers prepare. Hatches open. Safety pins are removed. Final adjustments are made to compensate for wind and speed. The Norden bombsight locks onto aim points defined hours earlier in briefing rooms far away. Factories. Rail yards. Government districts. Release commands pass through intercoms. Bombs fall. From altitude, they appear slow, almost graceful, tumbling through layers of cloud and smoke. Then the ground responds. Explosions ripple across the city. Smoke columns rise, merging into a spreading canopy that obscures streets and landmarks. The raid unfolds not as a single moment, but as a prolonged passage. Wave after wave crosses the target area. Timing ensures overlap, denying defenders respite. Fires ignite even as new bombs fall nearby. For civilians below, there is no clear beginning or end. Only duration. For the bomber crews, the most dangerous phase follows. Turning away from the target exposes aircraft to renewed interception. Formations adjust, tighten, compensate for losses. Escorts remain, engaging pursuing fighters aggressively. When the stream finally pulls away from Berlin, the sky behind it is changed. Smoke hangs over the city, drifting eastward. Fires burn unchecked in places. Anti-aircraft guns continue firing briefly, then fall silent as targets move beyond range. Above, the bomber force regroups for the long flight home. The mission has not ended. Losses will still occur. Damaged aircraft may not make it back. But something decisive has already happened. The German capital has been struck in daylight by a force so large that defense itself appeared finite. And within the Luftwaffe command structure, the implications begin to settle, not as panic, but as recognition. The return flight exposes the truth of the day. As the bomber stream pulls westward, German fighters attempt renewed interception. The effort is determined but uneven. Squadrons that launched earlier are low on fuel or ammunition. Others arrive late, climbing hard to reach altitude as escorts close in. Engagements fragment across the sky. There is no single battle line, only dozens of simultaneous encounters spread along the retreating stream. Escorts press their advantage, forcing Luftwaffe pilots into defensive maneuvers that burn fuel rapidly. Many disengage not by choice, but by necessity. For American crews, the danger remains constant. Damaged aircraft struggle to maintain speed. Some fall behind the main body, immediately drawing attention. Escorts break formation to cover them, fighting delaying actions until fuel limits force separation. Not all are saved. Over Germany and the Low Countries, bombers peel away toward emergency fields or ditch in rivers and fields. Parachutes dot the sky. Some crews are captured. Others are killed before reaching the ground. The cost of the mission is paid in lives measured quietly, without ceremony. Yet as the formations cross back toward the coast, a pattern is unmistakable. The Luftwaffe's response has been insufficient. Reports compiled that evening tell a stark story. Fighter losses are high. Interceptions were delayed. Coordination between radar stations and squadrons faltered under the volume of contacts. Flak expended enormous quantities of ammunition with limited effect relative to the scale of the attack. Most telling is what did not happen. The bomber stream was never broken. Previous raids had been turned back, scattered, or significantly reduced before reaching their targets. This time, despite losses, the majority of aircraft reached Berlin, released their ordnance, and returned in formation. For German commanders, this marks a turning point not defined by a single statistic, but by a strategic realization: existing defenses cannot scale to meet the threat. The American approach has removed choice. The right can no longer decide where to concentrate its air defense. When bombers arrive in such numbers, everywhere becomes a priority simultaneously. This realization spreads quickly through reports and after-action summaries. The language is careful, but the implication is clear. Even if individual raids can still be contested, the trend is unfavorable. Attrition favors the attacker. Time favors the attacker. Within days, similar missions follow. Not every raid reaches the same scale, but the precedent holds. Large formations become normal rather than exceptional. Escorts range freely. German fighter strength continues to decline, not from a single defeat, but from continuous pressure. For American command, the success validates years of doctrine and months of loss. The theory of daylight strategic bombing, supported by mass and escort, has proven viable against the most heavily defended city in Europe. The victory is not celebrated. Losses remain heavy. Crews know that survival on one mission does not guarantee survival on the next. But the sense of futility that once accompanied deep raids diminishes. For Berlin's population, the effect is profound. Daylight no longer offers separation from war. The sky itself becomes a source of threat. Normal life is interrupted not occasionally, but predictably. The sound of engines overhead carries a new meaning, not a raid that might be deflected, but a force that will arrive regardless. German morale reports note increased fatigue and resignation. Civil defense struggles to keep pace with damage. Repair crews work continuously. Transportation is disrupted. Factories experience delays. None of this collapses the war effort immediately, but it erodes confidence steadily. Silence follows the raid in stages. First, the guns stop firing. Then the engines fade. Finally, only the sound of distant fires remains. The city does not fall quiet because it is unharmed, but because there is nothing left to shoot at. Above Europe, the sky clears. In that clearing lies the true turning point, not the destruction on the ground, but the understanding on both sides that the balance of the air war has shifted irrevocably. The question now is no longer whether Berlin can be defended from daylight mass bombing. It is how long Germany can continue fighting once that defense is gone. The answer will unfold not in a single day, but in the months that follow, as the consequences of this realization ripple outward through strategy, production, and human endurance. The aftermath of the raid does not announce itself with a single figure. It accumulates through reports, photographs, and quiet assessments written hours after the aircraft land. In Berlin, damage assessments begin almost immediately. Fires burn into the night, fed by ruptured gas lines and exposed industrial materials. Rail yards are cratered. Switching stations are disabled. Factory roofs collapse inward, machinery buried beneath debris. Administrative buildings suffer blast damage that interrupts communication and coordination. Civil defense teams work continuously. Streets are blocked by rubble. Tram lines are severed. Water mains fail in multiple districts, complicating firefighting efforts. Casualty figures are incomplete for days, revised repeatedly as bodies are recovered and injuries accounted for. The scale of disruption matters as much as the physical destruction. For the German war economy, the effects are uneven but cumulative. Some factories resume partial operation within days. Others remain offline for weeks. Transportation delays ripple outward, affecting production schedules far from the capital. Repairs consume manpower already stretched thin by earlier raids. On the Allied side, the cost is measured differently. Aircraft losses are tallied. Crews are listed as missing, killed, or captured. Empty bunks appear in barracks. Replacement crews arrive quietly, absorbing the routines of units still processing the absence of familiar faces. Loss rates, while significant, fall within projections. This matters more than any headline figure. The system absorbs the damage and continues functioning. Statistical summaries compiled by the 8th Air Force reveal the broader trend. Despite intense resistance, the majority of bombers reached their targets. Escort fighters accounted for a growing number of German aircraft destroyed in the air rather than on the ground. The Luftwaffe's ability to mount coordinated mass interceptions shows signs of strain. Intelligence analysts note changes in enemy behavior. Fewer fighters are encountered on subsequent missions. Those that appear often attack in smaller groups. Engagements are shorter, more cautious. Pilots disengage sooner, preserving aircraft at the expense of opportunity. Captured German documents and prisoner interrogations reinforce this picture. Fuel shortages are worsening. Training hours for new pilots have been reduced. Maintenance backlogs grow as spare parts become scarce. None of this suggests imminent collapse. Germany continues to fight. Production persists. Defenses adapt where possible. But the margin for recovery narrows. For civilians in Berlin, the raid marks a psychological threshold. Night bombing had been endured as something distant, impersonal. Daylight mass bombing is different. It strips away denial. The presence of hundreds of aircraft overhead creates a sense of exposure that cannot be reconciled with official assurances. Shelters fill faster. People remain underground longer. Productivity suffers not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. The rhythm of life adjusts to the expectation of interruption. Across occupied Europe, the impact is observed closely. Resistance movements note the growing presence of Allied air power. Civilians in neighboring regions watch the bomber streams pass overhead, recognizing that the center of the war is shifting west to east. For many, the sight of massed bombers becomes a sign not of destruction, but of approaching change. Within Allied command, planning accelerates. Air superiority is no longer an abstract goal. It is becoming measurable. The reduction in German fighter strength directly affects invasion timelines. Every aircraft destroyed in the air is one less threat to landing forces months later. The raid on Berlin is not treated as an isolated success. It becomes a reference point, a demonstration that the heaviest defenses can be penetrated repeatedly, at scale, and with acceptable losses. That understanding reshapes priorities. Targets are reassessed. Fighter production facilities move higher on the list. Oil infrastructure receives increased attention. The focus shifts from symbolic strikes to systemic breakdown. What began as a test of endurance evolves into a campaign of dismantling. The silence that follows the raid is not peace. It is the pause between blows, filled with calculations on both sides about what comes next. And what comes next will determine not just the fate of Berlin, but the direction of the war itself. In the weeks that follow, the pattern established over Berlin repeats itself across Germany. Large daylight raids become routine rather than exceptional. Bomber streams grow longer, escorts range farther, and German responses grow thinner. The Luftwaffe is forced into a reactive posture, scrambling to defend multiple targets simultaneously with diminishing resources. The consequences extend beyond the air war. German aircraft production increases on paper, but effectiveness declines. New fighters arrive with inexperienced pilots. Fuel shortages limit training and operational readiness. Engines wear out faster than they can be replaced. Units are rotated constantly, preventing recovery. Airfields become targets themselves. Runways are cratered. Hangars destroyed. Aircraft caught on the ground are lost without ever engaging the enemy. Each successful raid compounds previous damage, turning recovery into a moving target. For Allied planners, this shift is decisive. By early 1944, confidence in achieving air superiority over Western Europe grows. This confidence underpins every subsequent operation. The Normandy invasion, still in planning stages, depends on control of the skies. Without it, amphibious landings would face unacceptable losses from air attack. The bomber campaign over Berlin and other German cities directly enables this outcome. By forcing the Luftwaffe into constant defense, the Allies dictate tempo. German fighters cannot concentrate against invasion forces if they are already stretched thin defending cities and infrastructure. This strategic linkage is understood clearly within Allied command. Air power is no longer a supporting arm. It is a prerequisite. For German leadership, the implications are grim. Resources are diverted to air defense at the expense of ground forces. Flak guns intended for the front are pulled back to protect cities. Ammunition stockpiles are drained rapidly. Civilian industry is increasingly mobilized for repairs rather than expansion. Propaganda adapts, emphasizing resilience and sacrifice. But confidence erodes. Reports from regional commanders describe declining morale among both civilians and air defense crews. The sense of control that once defined the Reich's interior space diminishes. Berlin, once considered untouchable, becomes emblematic of vulnerability. The city continues to function, but under strain. Government offices relocate. Archives are dispersed. Administrative routines are disrupted. Leadership operates in an environment of constant interruption. For American aircrews, the war remains personal and dangerous. Losses continue. Missions are still measured in survival. The difference lies not in safety, but in purpose. Crews understand that each raid contributes directly to a larger outcome. The sky is no longer a stalemate. It is a domain being won. By spring, the effects are visible from the air. Fewer interceptors rise to meet the bombers. Flak remains heavy in places, but coordination suffers. Escorts roam freely, strafing airfields and transportation networks on the return leg. The Luftwaffe is no longer dictating terms of engagement. When Allied troops land in Normandy in June 1944, German air response is limited and sporadic. The absence is not accidental. It is the cumulative result of months of pressure, attrition, and strategic bombing. The 1,000-bomber raids over Berlin are not remembered for a single dramatic photograph or statistic. They matter because they demonstrate that industrial warfare can be directed, scaled, and sustained until resistance becomes structurally impossible. The silence that descends over German skies in mid-1944 is not sudden. It is earned through repetition. And that silence carries forward, shaping the final year of the war in ways that are both measurable and deeply human. What remains, once the machinery has done its work, is the question of meaning, what this moment revealed about power, organization, and the cost of modern war. The sky over Berlin on that winter morning of 1944 was more than a battlefield. It was a statement. Not of cruelty, but of scale. not of single heroics, but of coordination, endurance, and human will exercised through machines. 1,000 bombers did not fall from the sky by chance. They were the product of factories, runways, engineers, planners, and crews who understood their roles as parts of a larger organism. Each man inside the aircraft, pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunner, was subject to the immense weight of systems larger than himself. Survival depended on precision, discipline, and trust, not luck alone. For the defenders, the moment revealed the limits of preparation. No skill, no courage, no ingenuity could fully counter a force designed to overwhelm. The Luftwaffe's failure was not merely tactical, it was structural. The city beneath the wings, once secure, discovered that endurance alone could not protect it from a sky that had become an instrument of inevitability. The raid also reframed the ethics of war. Daylight bombing promised accuracy but delivered consequences that touched civilians indiscriminately. History measures damage in tons of explosives, numbers of aircraft lost, and missions completed, but it also measures human experience, fear, fatigue, and adaptation. Those on both sides of the skies felt the psychological gravity of what modern warfare had become. Yet within that calculus lies the lesson of organization. Modern war is not won by isolated valor, it is won by sustained pressure applied through systems, logistics, and relentless execution. The 1,000 bombers were proof that scale can enforce outcomes faster and more decisively than force alone. Berlin eventually recovered. The city endured further raids, yet the moment remained symbolic. It marked a turning point, demonstrating that air power could shape the trajectory of war, preparing the path for invasion, defeat, and, ultimately, the reshaping of Europe. And in the silence after the engines faded, the human mind could finally perceive the magnitude of what had passed, a sky filled with machines, a city beneath them, and a world learning that the rules of conflict had changed forever.